Good evening, everyone. I do want to remind everybody that we do have a drawing for a door prize at the end of the meeting, so if you haven't signed in and put a slip of paper in the bag in the back, otherwise your chances of winning are nil. So, but anyway, what I want to do this evening is talk about the defensive works that were around the town of Tullahoma during 1863. And I'm not going to talk about the Tullahoma campaign. I can't outdo Dr. Bradley, don't want to outdo Dr. Bradley. He's a great resource and knows far more about the campaign than I do. But I do want to take a little time to just set the stage as to how the Army came to be in Tullahoma, so we'll start off with a little vicinity map, and this shows the area roughly between Murfreesboro and Tullahoma. We've highlighted some of the towns that figured into the retreat of Bragg's army from Murfreesboro down to Tullahoma. And you'll recall that after the Battle of Stones River or Murfreesboro, Bragg decided, even though the battle was a tactical draw, it became a strategic victory for the Union forces because Bragg decided to withdraw his forces and gave the Union a much-needed victory on the heels of their great defeat at Fredericksburg. So the Army retreated southward, and the Union Army took up position in Murfreesboro, while one corps of the Army of Tennessee took a position near Shelbyville, while the other wing took a position in Fairfield. Bragg actually wanted to make his line of defense on the Elk River, but when he notified Richmond that he had already moved his headquarters to Winchester and was going to defend the Elk River, the War Department in Richmond sent an immediate telegram back to him and said, no, you're going to defend the line of the Duck River. And so he turned around, and by January the 9th of 1863, took up his position as his headquarters in Tullahoma. So once he decided to occupy Tullahoma, they had to start to think about what they were going to do from a defensive standpoint. And the first defenses, obviously, were just hasty defenses. Abattis were basically put in place to block the roads and restrict the cavalry from coming towards the Army. And these were just felled trees, much like are done to, set up roadblocks. So the first defenses were very rudimentary. But on February the 9th, Captain John Morris Wampler, the acting chief engineer of Bragg's army, and Captain Stephen Wilson Pressman, who was an engineer in Hardee's Corps, were ordered to report to General Bragg. And in the meeting, Wampler and his engineering staff were charged by Bragg with laying out the defenses of Tullahoma. Now, Captain Wampler had been born in Maryland, and he had joined the U.S. Coast Survey in 1847 at the age of 17. And he had commanded an infantry company at 1st Manassas and fought at Ball's Bluff. But his skills as a topographical engineer were realized, and he was sent west and served as an engineer officer during the Perryville campaign. Now, Captain Pressman had joined the Army and entered service in the ranks of the 17th Virginia Infantry, and he transferred to the Corps of Engineers and was assigned to the west, joining Hardee's Corps, where he commanded the Corps Pioneer Company, which would be equivalent today to the combat engineers. So the engineers came in, they established their camp on the hill near Bragg's headquarters. Captain Wampler began his survey by riding horseback with Captain Pressman, and the party included Captain John W. Green and Lieutenant Henry N. Farr. So he immediately had his staff start surveying a defensive position around Tullahoma. Captain Green was a civil engineer by profession, and he was much older than the rest of the engineering staff. Before the war, he had spent 20 years in the lumber industry, and when the war began, he joined the 4th Louisiana Battalion. When his term of service expired, he worked for the Vicksburg, Shreveport, and Texas Railroad until he received a commission as lieutenant in the Engineer Corps, and then within a short period of time, he became the chief engineer of Hardee's Corps. And like Green, Lieutenant Farr had been a professional engineer before the war, and he had enlisted in the 1st Arkansas Mounted Rifles and was wounded in the leg at Wilson's Creek. After his recovery, he was assigned to Polk's Corps as an engineer. So the initial works were around Tullahoma were hastily constructed to cover the town's approaches. And the survey, the map you see here, was drawn up by Lieutenant John Haney of the Washington Artillery. And it shows the earthworks in their early stage of construction, covering the approaches from Lynchburg to the west, Shelbyville, and terminating near what would be the Country Club Drive area in Tullahoma. And the defensive positions looked out over a half-mile of cleared stumps, abattis, and swamp with the woods and thicket beyond. As you see here, the first defenses, they're trying to cover key points, and some redans were established. This is redan number 1, which could mount 4 guns. Redan number 2 could mount 5 guns. Redan number 3, 5 guns. This covered basically the area where State Route 130 would be today. Redan number 4, 2 guns. 5 had 4 guns, or could cover 4 guns, and redan number 6, 4 guns. Now the last 3 redans that I mentioned were basically in the area of Old Fort Street, Crestwood, that area of Tullahoma. There were also redans set up on the east side of Rock Creek, and when this map was drawn up, obviously it was pretty early in the process because Lieutenant Haney had not numbered these. But you see on the east side of town how they covered the roads and the approaches. And also you see that they could mount several pieces of artillery. Now, just because they could hold or mount this much artillery doesn't mean this many artillery pieces were actually in Tullahoma at that time. They were basically prepping the site so that if the earthworks had to be actually used, then they would be easily occupied by the Confederate forces. Because the bulk of the Army, as you recall, were either in Shelbyville or in Fairfield. The other thing you should note is that on the map you see from Lieutenant Haney, you'll see these areas here of where the ground has been cleared. You know, Tullahoma back then is much like it is today, has a lot of woods and undergrowth, and in front of all the earthworks were cleared these areas. And you can see the line on the map of the cleared areas, and then you can see where the works are and the clearing behind the works. So basically, you've got areas ranging from 800 yards to 500 yards of cleared areas for fire. And that's important because during the Civil War, effective musketry range was about 200 yards. And this was important from the standpoint of making sure that you didn't have any obstructions or areas where the enemy could move up on your forces. Also, in front of the works were different forms of chevaux de frise. These were basically field obstructions or obstacles that were put out to slow the advance of any enemy. Keep in mind, during the Civil War, barbed wire had not been invented. Barbed wire was actually produced in the West after the war and used to divide lands in the prairie where there wasn't much timber. Probably the closest thing to barbed wire that was used would have been around Fort Sanders in late 63, when the Union Army at Fort Sanders put telegraph wire and lay it on the ground and use that as an obstacle for attacking troops. But the whole purpose is to create a good defensive position, and you can see where your trench or your earthworks would be, and then you'd have a palisade you'd have advanced rifle pits, the abattis, and then this would be where the approaching enemy would be coming up. During the Civil War, the troops used muzzle loaders so that anything you could do to slow the advance of the enemy would be important to hold your position because you needed time to reload your firearms. Now, artillery had an effective range of 1,000 yards, and this shows an overlay of the map that shows why it was cleared so far back. So you can see that even though the line was hastily put together, they started with covering the key points and quickly created a good defensive perimeter or zone. Now, these sketches appeared in Thomas Berry's book, 4 Years with Morgan and Forrest, and he used those to describe the Confederate works in Tullahoma. Now, actually, these sketches here are from photographs that were taken after the Battle of Spotsylvania, but we don't really have any photographs of Tullahoma during the war itself. But obviously, Berry felt that they were very representative of the works that were put in place because he used them in his book. So this gives you an idea of, here you have an emplacement for artillery, here you see the obstructions, the abattis, to slow up any advancing enemy forces. Now, in late February of '63, the weather was unseasonably warm, and the decision was taken to extend the line on the right, or the eastern flank, and to further strengthen the existing works. So before you saw where the line was set up in redans, and now a decision was taken to try to connect those. And so the earthworks were extended so that there would be a continuous line around Tullahoma. And on February 29th of 1863, Captain Wampler rode around the town's perimeter a second time and basically began construction of a new and stronger defensive line. As a matter of fact, one regiment was talking about how on March 3rd they were ordered a mile from town on the Normandy Road and began constructing breastworks, and they cleared out so much land that Tullahoma became locally known as Bragg's New Ground, or Bragg's Clearing, because there'd been so much of the woodland around Tullahoma cut out. But the work began with under the supervision of Wampler and Lieutenant Andrew H. Buchanan. And Buchanan was a professional engineer, and for 7 years before the war he had been professor of mathematics at Cumberland University in Lebanon, Tennessee. And it was a team effort. J.C. Crenshaw created a new map for the fortifications, and Wampler added his cartographic skills to the effort. And Renshaw was somewhat of a rarity for the Army at that time because he was a civilian contractor, and he worked in the engineering headquarters as assistant engineer. But by its completion in the late spring, the line extended in a semicircle covering the approaches from the north, east, and west. And this shows the final layout of the Confederate line. During the latter part of the construction, the rain started setting in. It was a very wet spring and became one of the big factors in the Tullahoma campaign itself. But they really struggled with getting the line finished because of the amount of mud that was out there. But the line represented about 17,600 linear feet of earthworks. So that's about 3.5 miles of earthworks. And this is a map. This map here was actually drafted by the Union Army by Captain Merrill on July 6, 1863, after they had occupied the ground. So they had, once the Confederates had left Tullahoma, they surveyed the land and did a survey of the works around Tullahoma. But this should show, again, just a representation of having that continuous line around Tullahoma and how it would be used in a defensive manner. Now, I also want to start talking a little bit about some of the works inside the city. And the most prominent work was Fort Raines. Now the contemporary accounts, when you look at the accounts by the soldiers and the officers that were engaged in the construction of the fort, before it became named Fort Raines, they always referred to it as a star fort. The fort was not actually named until May 23rd, and it was named after Brigadier General John Raines, who was killed in action in Murfreesboro. This is showing how a star fort would have been laid out and how it was referred to by the troops. But when you actually look at the drawings of the fort, it's really a bastion fort. And a bastion fort was a more modern fortification than a star fort. Star forts were used a lot during the Revolutionary War and during the interwar period through the War of 1812 and so forth. But as expertise and field engineering became more sophisticated, you started to see a bastion fort used. And the reason is pretty obvious when you look at it from the standpoint of defensive fields of fire. Here's a star fort. Well, a star fort is most vulnerable by an attack right at the point of the star, because the defenders' fire are diverging from the attacking column. If you had a column going this way, then you see the fire is going away from that column. So the engineers started to construct in the field bastion forts, and the bastion fort had the advantage in that you could lay a field of fire to cover the approaches to the bastion. In other words, if a force was attacking right at the point, as they would on a star fort, you could still lay down a defensive fire from this line here and also from here and help repel the attack. So some of the key features on a fort at that time that were common during the Civil War. This is the glacis, the rampart, the ditch, parapet, and the embrasure. And of course, all this is designed to expose the attacking forces as much as possible to the fire of the defenders. Now, probably the most detailed map, topographical map of Tullahoma that shows the earthworks was actually performed completed in April of 1865. The occupation forces had been in town for 2 years, and it was decided to go ahead and do a new survey of Tullahoma. And this survey was performed by James Willett, who was the chief inspector of the railroad defenses with the Department of the Cumberland. And of course, at this time, the main thing the Army was involved with in the Tullahoma area was defense of the railroad. This here is just should give you an orientation to the map that was done by Willett to show the different quadrants of the city. You have the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, the McMinnville branch, or the what would be today the Caney Fork and Western Railroad, except at that time it only went to McMinnville. It didn't go all the way to Sparta. And then you see the other roads, the modern day designations of the roads. This gives you an idea of how the town is oriented in today's layout. And these are the highlighted works in and around Tullahoma. Now, if we take this map and go into a little more detail, we can kind of zoom in on different parts of the town and show how they were laid out. These are the northwest defenses and Fort Raines. And so we've highlighted in red the earthworks. And then this is Fort Raines right here. It's just right off of Hogan Street, between Hogan and Washington. This area where Fort Street, and Dr. Bradley lives over there too. He likes to comment on it. He's not too far away from the fort. But it actually covered about 4.5 acres. Could mount between 12 and 13 pieces of artillery. And actually, when the Confederate Army retreated, they left about 6 what the Union Army called siege guns, which have been heavy artillery. And my guess is because of the heavy rain and everything, they just couldn't get them out of the fort. They had to abandon the guns. And this right here would be just taking a shot. The arrow gives you the camera angle and just shows you what that area looks like today. It's all neighborhoods and houses now, so there's nothing left of the works, but at least it gives you an idea of what part of town the Fort Raines was located in. Now, if we look in the next detail, these are the northeast defenses in the Manchester approach. And this would be in the vicinity of Manchester Highway near the Armory building. And this area here is given another camera view of where those earthworks in red are. And this is the old Armory. Of course, it's still in use, but the earthworks would have been in this vicinity here. Now, another detail, the southeast defenses. This will be kind of going out towards the base. And you see here, this is just beyond the bowling alley and that area. And here you see the hilltop or the ridge line there. And Bragg had built a military road in front of it to access the southeastern part of his lines. But that's where the earthworks were located at that point in time. Now we look at the southwest defenses in the Fayetteville approach. And this is a view towards the east from West Lincoln Street. And just beyond these trees here, this is another ridge line, so that's obviously why they set up the earthworks in this area. And this is the area of Old Fort Street, Crestwood, and that part of town there. So this would be, if you were attacking the defenses, you can see how you would have to be going up this rise. And of course at that time this had all been cleared off and they would have had a clear field of fire against you. Now we're going to go into town a little bit and look and see where some of the earthworks were in town. And these are the inner defenses near the area of South Jefferson and between Warren and Lauderdale. And this is a drawing from the timetable. I think, I don't know if Mr. Powell had done that drawing or if he was involved in that or not, but basically this shows the Catron House. This is the inner defenses, and the red line here, you have Jefferson Street, this is Franklin Street, Warren Street, here's Jackson Street here. So, and this is, if you're standing in that same intersection but then turn to your right, this shows going up West Warren Street. So you can see a little bit of a rise right there. That's where this line would have been here. And these works went all the way across Jackson Street over to Atlantic and to where the railroad is. Now also on the inner defenses, on West Grundy Street, right behind this building here at City Hall, looking south. Here's Grundy Street, and I love windows. Okay. Let me go back here. Okay. Here's Grundy Street. We're in the building right here. So if you were to go out this building and walk down in the parking lot behind City Hall or along Grundy Street and look to your left, here's this ridge line here. That's this area right here, and you can see how it overlooks Lincoln Street. Lincoln Street would be down in here, and here's Jefferson Street going up behind the church and the post office that way. But you can see here the inner works would have been along this area right here, a good elevated position to cover the town proper. And then if you take your camera and just turn around and look to the north, still standing behind City Hall, this is the area across of Grundy Street, and you can see here that would be this area here. So the earthworks were extended further to the north. They started here and then went up. So if you actually go out there in the daylight and stand there, you can get a good feel for what a commanding position that had in town. If someone got past the outer works and came into town, then there were considerable works in the town proper. Keep in mind, the outer works were more designed for handling an army or an army corps, whereas the inner works were more for the garrison, be it the headquarters company and the regiments that were guarding Bragg's headquarters and his supply. You know, basically Tullahoma was a supply depot, a hospital center for the Army. There were several hospitals in town, so it provided defenses for them. And then after the Confederate troops left, these works were then used by the Union garrison to defend the depot and the supplies that the Union forces had in this area. Now if we go further north, another detail. This is in the inner defenses. This is near the Hanging Tree site on West Blackwell Street. And this is showing how the earthworks went around. And this is just a blow-up of that sketch that was done in 1865. And you can see here that they've got, you know, I don't know if that's representing a gallows or a graveyard, or it almost looks like a tombstone here. But this is the location of the Hanging Tree in Tullahoma on West Blackwell Street. This photograph was taken after it had been destroyed in a storm. So the tree was living well into the 20th century. And this is basically a view of it today. So you go out there, here's the house right here. This right here looks to me about where the old Hanging Tree was located. So this will give you an idea of where that was. That's looking in this direction here. But those earthworks came around this section here. And also, if you go down kind of behind St. Paul's Church, going towards Rock Creek, and then turn around and look back up the hill, this is the area of the works. This is this view here of showing where the defensive line would have been. Now, we took the map from 1865, and I wanted to be able to give you a little bit of an overlay of where things are today. Now, this is not the latest USGS map. This is one from the late 70s or early 80s, but I wanted something that wasn't completely cluttered so that you could get a little bit of an orientation. But this is just the standard 7.5 minute map that you get from the Corps of Engineers, or the USGS, that is. And so the red lines here basically show you the layout of where the defenses were on top of a modern map, or a more modern map. And you can see here's the Westwood area, Westwood Drive, Old Fort Street. This is out Cumberland Avenue. This is 130 here, Pinewood Heights. And then you see here on the north side of town, here's the high school. If you go out Jackson Street, near the edge of the property of the high school, there's a drain that cuts across Jackson Street. So they're on the south side of that drainage area. And then the perimeter wraps around and is just beyond East Lincoln School. You have the fort, Star Fort here, and then here's the armory area, and then here's that area out like you're going towards the base. Now, this is just a view of downtown Tullahoma today, and I wanted to try to do something to illustrate, maybe give you a feel for, you know, what did maybe Tullahoma look like possibly during the war if we could go back to this same intersection and get in a balloon and go up 80 feet or whatever and just see what we have. And so this is basically a representation of how Tullahoma may have looked during the war. And in it, you'll see that we have Polk Street, and then you have the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, Lincoln, Grundy, and Atlantic Street, Washington Street, the depot, The hotel, which a lot of times at that time was called the Lincoln House, and it may have fallen in disfavor as far as that name when it was occupied, when the Confederate Army was here. And then you have Fort Raines and the Confederate winter quarters. Brigadier General Clayton's brigade was charged with building the fort, and so it's likely that he would have had his troops stationed nearby. But this gives you a rough idea of maybe how Tullahoma looked. And if you go back, let's go back to that modern photo. You know, Fort Raines would have been in the distance out in here. And so this gives you a little bit of a feel for how the area may have looked at that point in time. Now, I'm not going to rehash the Tullahoma campaign, but as many of you know, what happened was that the Union Army under Rosecrans outflanked Bragg. Bragg wanted to attack the Union forces as they were advancing on Tullahoma, but both of his corps commanders were pretty balky when it came to following orders, and so his plans never came to fruition. And the Union Army sent 2 corps down what would be the Manchester Highway towards Tullahoma, and one of the objectives that they had after they had gone through the Gap and gone through Manchester was their objective was the Concord Church. And the Concord Church is on the Tullahoma side of Crumpton Creek. You know, so it's pretty obvious, you know, they didn't want any of the creeks used as defensive lines, so that's why they made that as one of the objectives. Bragg wanted to stay and fight at Tullahoma, but he finally changed his mind. Probably what drove it was that the Elk River, due to just the heavy rains that had happened during the whole campaign, the heavy rains made crossing the Elk River problematical if you lost any of your bridges. And he came very close to losing some bridges down at Deckard when Wilder went around his right flank. And so Bragg decided that he would withdraw. Had the river not been out of its banks, there's a really good chance there would have been a major battle fought at Tullahoma, and it would be the equal of Vicksburg and Gettysburg, which were happening almost simultaneously. But the bottom line when it comes to Tullahoma is that you know, it was indeed a fortress. It was a strong position. Surgeon John Beach of the 40th Ohio Infantry wrote in August 1863 that several large forts with long lines of breastworks reaching for miles into the country showed how difficult it would have been to have forced Bragg out by direct approach. So I think what he was saying is that you know, Rosecrans' campaign and maneuver was obviously the right strategy, and not making a frontal attack in Tullahoma was the way to go. In regard to the engineers that worked on the line and laid out that line around Tullahoma, I just want to talk a little bit about what happened to them after the war. Captain Wampler was killed in action at Battery Wagner on August 17, 1863, during the siege of Charleston. The Confederate batteries in Charleston were being shelled by Union monitors, and he had begun writing a letter home when a shell exploded where he was sitting, and he was obliterated. So he only survived a couple months after his work here in Tullahoma. Lieutenant Pressman, who worked on the line, was killed on January 30th, 1865, when he was crushed by the ash box of a tender when he stumbled while trying to cross the tracks of the Piedmont Railroad in North Carolina. So, and he had been a railroad man by trade, so that was a bad break right there. Both Lieutenants Buchanan and Farr survived the war, and Buchanan probably had the most notable career. He returned to Cumberland University, and he served on the faculty for a total of 49 years and before his retirement in 1911. And during his tenure on the faculty, he had worked as a consultant for the Coast and Geodetic Survey, and he was involved in the triangulation of much of Tennessee. So he ended up being one of the great surveyors for, that helped map the state of Tennessee. So Tullahoma, even though there was not a major battle fought here, it indeed was an important point. It was a fortress, and it really is, I think, worth noting where the earthworks were. There aren't many pieces of it left. There are very few segments left, but it's just something to keep in mind as you go around town, and it gives you a good idea of scale. You know, a lot of times you think about the Civil War and what happened and the populations that were involved in it, but you have to keep in mind during the Civil War, Nashville's population was about 20,000 people. So the city of Nashville during the Civil War was only slightly bigger than Tullahoma is today. So you kind of have to keep that in perspective when you look at the number of people that were killed in the war, the losses that were incurred. You can see how the heavy losses, the high casualty rates among the men in the regiments really impacted families and the people of this country, regardless of whichever side they were fighting on, you know, for generations to come. And we're still, you know, feeling some of the effects of the Civil War to this day. You know, if you want to look, why, you know, like I said, look how East Tennessee votes versus West Tennessee votes, and a lot of that can be drawn back to the Civil War. So that concludes my presentation this evening, and I'll be happy to try to answer any questions if you have any. Yes, Mark?
Do you have any sense in a combined how many Union there were and how many Confederate armies actually, as a number, were passed through state at one time or the other were camped in Tullahoma?
Well, most of the troops were, the cavalry was working the area between from Shelbyville north towards Nashville. And if you look at the time period from January of '63 to June of '63, that whole area in front of Tullahoma was a highly contested area because that was really where the Army of Tennessee obtained their forage. The way the government in Richmond had set it up was that the War Department had allocated North Georgia and the land behind the Army of Tennessee as the forage and the subsistence area for the Army of Northern Virginia. And so the subsistence area, or where the supplies were allocated for the Army of Tennessee, were north of Tullahoma. So basically they were having to fight for forage, and that's why there were many cavalry engagements at Thompson Station, at Franklin, at Brentwood, Laverne. You know, the reason that during that time period you had a lot of cavalry fights were these were fights over forage. And keep in mind the big thing about, you know, when you're dealing with, you know, that's why armies like to cling to railroads. Railroads had the advantage of locomotives. When they weren't being used, they didn't eat anything, you know. But horses, and, you know, had to be fed, and whether they were being used or not. And so, you know, the demands for forage were very heavy. And so that's why that whole area between Nashville and Tullahoma was hotly contested for that 6-month period, which ended up really being the longest period of where a Confederate army was able to remain undisturbed, relatively undisturbed. The encampment at Tullahoma was the longest encampment of the entire war for any Confederate army. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's another one of those notable things about Tullahoma. Anything else? Well, yes, sir.
Are there any existing works that you can still see or visible around there?
There's some over towards State Route 130 behind some of the houses over there in that area there. I've been told there might be a piece of some earthworks on the railroad right-of-way south of town, but I've walked back there a few times and I haven't been able to find it. But you know, they could be just swells now. And so, but most of the works are gone. The Fort Raines was pretty much leveled in the 1950s as that part of town grew, and that part was not preserved. And so there's nothing to be seen there anymore. But, you know, it's, you know, they call it progress, you know, so anything else?
I grew up at Beach Grove, and when I was much younger, we found a lot of mini malls both around Hoover's Gap, Beach Grove, Noah, through that particular area.
Oh yeah, and you can imagine all the, you know, during the as Tullahoma was developed, I can just imagine the number of people out there with metal detectors and things like that. Where, because you know, if you're in an encampment for a long period of time, every camp's got a trash pit, and every trash pit's going to have broken pieces of bridle or belt, pieces of belts, or you know, all sorts of different hardware and garbage that we, you know, but now you dig it up and it's like you think you've, you know, found something. But you know, in Tullahoma proper, during the war, when the Confederate Army occupied it, the number of infantry troops was relatively small. You had Clayton's brigade that was here for a period of time. You had Maningot's brigade that was here that occupied Fort Raines after it had been built by Clayton's men, and then of course you had the provost marshal for the Confederate Army here. You know, the reason there was a hanging tree is that, you know, deserters or spies, you know, met their fate over there on Blackwell Street. So you know, if you believe in ghost stories and things like that, there's probably some you could generate, but you know. It's and of course you had a pretty large number of the houses that were still here. You know, keep in mind, right before the war started, in 1860 or 61, there was a massive fire in town, and a lot of the structures were consumed. You know, they were frame houses, and so the town was just beginning to recover from the big fire. So the number of houses was relatively small. But you still had the Lincoln Hotel that was the main hotel. You had the depot, and of course with the junction with the Minville branch of the railroad, you know, made this a good place to bring supplies up. Anything else? Well, I appreciate you coming tonight. We do have we're going to let Mark draw the door prize out. Thank you.
Thank you.